Esta conversación fue grabada en inglés en la Casa Spotify, con motivo de la visita de Jane Goodall a Colombia, gracias a Elemental y Comfama. Más de 60 años de investigación y activismo convierten a Jane en una leyenda viva de la lucha por la conservación en el planeta. Pues con su trabajo, no solo ha cambiado la forma en la que entendemos a los chimpancés, sino también a nuestra misma especie. Bienvenidos a Elemental, un podcast sobre el único planeta con vida del que tenemos noticia, nuestra relación con él y sus demás especies.
Jane, as always, a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for taking time in your very busy agenda for being here.
Thanks for inviting me to join you because, well, it's lovely to see you again.
It's not only lovely to see you again, but it's lovely to see you in my country. Not only because it's my country, but because it's one of the most biodiverse places on Earth.
I know.
So to have you here is just very exciting to me. So tell us how a little kid from London in the 1950s, where not only was very difficult to travel, but you coming from a low-income family, made it all the way to Africa, following her dreams, and ended up actually living with wild animals. How did that happen?
Well, you have to go back.
Let's go back.
For a little girl who was born loving animals, all animals. I don't know where it came from. I was born that way. So I was taking worms to bed with me when I was 1.5, apparently, according to my mother, wondering how they walked without legs. And I had this super supportive mother. And she got books to me about animals, and she never got mad if I was out late because I once spent 4 hours trying to find out where was the hole on the hen big enough for an egg to come out, which I did. And so when I was 10, I found this little book, Tarzan of the Apes, and I just had enough pocket money saved up to buy it. And I read it from cover to cover. And, little girls of 10 are very romantic. And I fell passionately in love with this glorious Lord of the Jungle. And what did Tarzan do? He married the wrong Jane. Well, he did, right?
He did.
Anyway, that was when my dream began. I knew there wasn't a Tarzan, but I'm going to grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals and write books about them. And everybody laughed. How would I do that? Africa was far away. We didn't have money. And I was just a girl. No, Mum, if you really want to do this, you're going to have to work terribly hard, take advantage of every opportunity. And hopefully, if you don't give up, you find a way. So, I had that support. Couldn't go to university. We didn't have enough money. Had to get money, had to pay my way. Got a job as a secretary. We had enough money for that course. And then came...
In London? You got that job in London?
I got the job in London. But my home was Bournemouth on the south coast, where there were more cliffs and animals and things. But then my job was in London. Then came a letter from a school friend whose parents had moved to Kenya, inviting me for a holiday. So that was the opportunity, but you couldn't save money in London. So I went home, worked as a waitress, jolly hard work, for I think it took about 5 months, saving up my wages and my tips until I could actually afford the fare. You had to get a return. It was under British rule back then, and they wouldn't take people unless they could prove they could go away again. So my first trip was by boat because aeroplanes were not many and very, very expensive.
How long did it take you to get there?
Well, it should have taken 2 weeks through the Suez Canal. But there was a war between Britain and Egypt. I have no idea what it was about. I think I should look it up one day. But anyway, so that meant we had to go all the way around the Cape. It took about a month, which was heaven. It was just magical.
Part of the adventure for you.
It was a real one, seeing, the grey sea got bluer and seeing a flying fish. And then there were dolphins around the boat. But it all got a bit nasty when I landed in Cape Town. First place I set foot on African soil. And kept seeing these words in Afrikaans on the backs of the hotels and the restaurants.
Apartheid was full force there.
Yes, I said, what do these words mean? White people only. And I wasn't brought up that way. You know, my grandfather was a congregational minister, and we judged people on who they were as human beings, not the color of their skin or their language.
So it was your first experience, like just watching something like that.
Yes, and the stories I heard, I mean, it was terrible.
And then, did you spend a lot of time in South Africa, in Cape Town?
No, we just were there 2 days while the ship got new fuel. And then it went on up to what was then Beira, and then landed in Mombasa, and then a train to Nairobi, and that's where my friend met me.
So your first country was Kenya.
Yeah, first country was Kenya.
And you went to visit a friend.
I went to visit a friend, and on the drive from Nairobi up to what was then the White Islands, the Kinnenkop, there was actually, I didn't realize at the time how rare it was, there was an aardvark on the road. You just passed giraffe. There was animals in Nairobi. There were no paved roads. It was a different world.
So you started to see wild animals as soon as you basically got touched Nairobi or Kenya.
Even before, along the train, you could see herds of giraffe and zebra.
How was that for you? That feeling?
It was just exciting. I'm here, you know. It was just complete magic.
And then how was the experience once you were actually there in Kenya? What do you do? I mean, did you got straight into working with animals, or how was it?
No, I stayed with my friend. I had a nice holiday, but I was taught, you know, you never overstay your welcome. And so actually the very first morning up in this farm, my friend ran into my room in the morning. She said, look out the window. Paw print of a big male leopard right outside the window.
Wow.
So anyway, I had fun with her. You know, I was a young girl back then, 23, and I flirted a lot. I had fun and, you know, did all the things that you would expect somebody to do. And then somebody said, Jane, if you're interested in animals, you should meet Louis Leakey, famous anthropologist, paleontologist. And that boring secretarial course I did, just 2 weeks before I met him, his secretary had announced she was leaving. And there I was. So now I'm surrounded by people who can answer all my questions about the animals and plants of Kenya.
And for how long did you do that secretarial job with this famous anthropologist, Louis Leakey?
It was a year.
Working with him as a secretary.
Well, a sort of almost like a PA, a personal assistant.
Yeah.
Because, you know, he was very volatile, and he would get a paper somebody had written about, you know, fossils or something, and I'd watch him, and he would explode. We were in the same room, and he would say rubbish and scratch with his red pen, go through the paper, bosh, fool, and then he'd say to me, "Get me so and so on the phone." And I thought, I was quite diplomatic in those days, so I pretended the person wasn't there. And by the time that I got through much later, he'd calmed down, and it was a reasonable conversation.
And how was that jump from being her personal assistant into actually going to work for him in what he was doing, in going and studying chimps?
Well, he wasn't studying chimps. He never even came to Gombe.
Oh, really?
No, but what happened was every summer, he and his wife and one other person and a few Kenyans would go to Olduvai Gorge, which is now very famous for discovering the remains of early humans, you know, hominids. But back then, it's in the middle of the Serengeti, and no human remains had been found. But the Leakeys went there for 3 months every summer, and he let me go with him. So it was me and this one other young girl. And back then, I mean, nobody will ever see the Serengeti as it was then. It was just, there were animals. It was like the beginning of the world. You know, elephants and zebras and ostriches, and it was just complete magic.
Let's have a parenthesis there, because I recently was at the Serengeti. I had the luck and to be there, and to me, it was. Despite I had the fortune to be in many amazing places, but to me that was a very powerful experience to be able to actually see animals living in the wild, and a lot of animals. But I know this idea of how the idea of a healthy environment changes with generations. And I'm pretty sure that despite the fact that I saw that, and to me it was so impactful and powerful, your line of how a healthy environment should look like, it's very different.
It's changed.
And you've seen it. So how big is the change?
It's huge. I mean, don't forget, I've been on this planet 90 years. And I've seen change in where I live in England. The change is huge. Half the birds have gone. Pesticides and, herbicides and so on. And so on the Serengeti, I've been there recently. And yes, you can still see lions and giraffe. And for people, like if you haven't been before, it is wonderful. I don't want to say it's not. But when you knew how it was before, and I've talked to a number of tourists who say, well, now that the guides can communicate with their radio, if there's a lion killed, they all tell each other. Yeah. And this man I was talking to, he said, I got there were 23 combis all the way around the Lion Pride. And he said, I could not get a photo without a combi in the background. So it's the too many tourists. But there's still parts, if you go far, where it's more wild.
But the change is impressive. I mean, for you.
Change for me is huge. And there are roads now. When I went, there wasn't even a road from Ngorongoro to Serenera. It was just a dirt track. Okay. And to Olduvai, there was nothing. The Likis had to kind of guess. But you asked, how did that lead me to chimps?
Yes, going back to the story, but I wanted to...
Going back, Gillian and I were allowed out in the evening after the hard day's work. And we were just allowed to walk out on the plains with all the animals.
Oh, really?
Yes. And I always had the feeling, well, if you don't hurt an animal, it's not going to hurt you. Of course, if they've been hunted, it's different, but there wasn't any hunting then. And on this one evening, we're walking along the bottom of the gorge, and something made me look back. And there was this young male lion, about 2 years old, mane growing on his...
And you were just walking by yourself?
With Gillian.
With Gillian?
Yes. And his tail was moving gently. And I think he was totally curious. He'd never seen anything like us. So Gillian wanted to go and hide in the thicket. And I said, well, no, the lion will know exactly where we are. We won't have a clue where the lion is. So I said, no, we need to walk up onto the plain where we're really visible. And that was the evening around the campfire that Leakey began talking to me about this group of chimps living on a lakeshore.
Wow, that's just amazing. And then from that point to go and study chimpanzees, how did that happen?
Well, it took a year. I mean, he asked if I would be prepared to go and try and study them. His reasoning, he believed, and it's now generally accepted, about 6 million, something like that, years ago, there was an ape-like, human-like creature. And that he reckoned that if I saw behavior similar or the same in chimps today and humans today, maybe that originated in that common ancestor, and we brought it with us along our separate evolutionary pathways. That would help him to imagine how the hominids whose fossils he was digging up, maybe how they behaved. That was his rationale. His theory, which is now pretty well proved. But anyway, it took a year to get money. I mean, I hadn't been to college.
Yeah, you were not a scientist.
No, so I went back to England and actually got a job at the zoo where there were 2 sad chimps. But anyway,
learning.
And finally he got money, but only for 6 months. And then the other problem, Tanzania was Tanganyika back then, was a British protectorate. And the British authorities said, a young girl in the forest by herself, absolutely no. So in the end they said, all right, but she can't come alone. So my amazing mother volunteered to come.
Oh my God, with you?
With me. And she stayed for 4 of the 6 months. And she was amazing because she boosted my morale. For 4 months the chimps ran away. They disappeared every time I got near them. So although I was seeing through my binoculars, I wasn't getting the kind of information that I knew I needed to get. And so when I got back...
And the money was running out?
Yeah, it was 4 months, 2 months left. But she boosted my morale a lot. She was pointing out all the time what I did, what I had learned. And she also had a little clinic for the local fishermen. They came for miles. She was actually known as a white witch doctor. And so she established really good relationships for me with the local people, boosted my morale. And sadly, she left just before the breakthrough observation, when the one chimp who'd begun to lose his fear of me, and I'd named him David Greybeard because he had a beautiful white hair on his chin, and I saw him breaking off grass stems, scratching at the top of the termite mound, pushing the grass stem in, doing like this a bit, pulling it carefully out, and picking off the termites. He was using a tool.
So that was the moment that you actually discovered this.
Yes.
Only 4 months into the research or
Yes,
into the
and it was
observation.
literally the turning point, because at that time we were defined as man the toolmaker, and David was not only just picking grasses to use, but sometimes picking twigs and having to remove all the leaves. So he was modifying it to make it into
Better.
a tool. So that's when Leakey sent his famous telegram, now we must redefine man, redefine tool, or accept chimps as humans. And that brought in the National Geographic. And they agreed to fund the research when the money ran out. So that was, the first time I could actually relax.
And that's when you were able to stay there for so many years. Describe to us how was, because people say, okay, Jane was there for 30 years living with chimps, but how was your day there? Do you actually went into the mountain and sometimes spent the night with chimps and wildlife around you, or you went like all the way up, observed them, and then all the way down to your house? How was
a tent? Mum and I had a tent
A tent.
between us, and it's not very high. The Rift Escarpment, the chimps don't go right up to the top because there's not much food there, so they're not very much higher than the lake. And well, it's quite a climb, but not too far.
Yeah.
You climbed, didn't you?
I climbed it.
Yes, right.
I climbed
So
it, and I
you
saw
know,
them. And
It's
and
not
it was,
really high.
It's not really high, really.
So mostly,
But they never came down to. Well, I remember when we were there that actually, when the night that we arrived, I remember one chimp that actually walked in front of your little house over there.
Yeah.
And we talked about it, and you said, well, he's coming to say hi. But then after that, we never saw them down there again. You needed to walk up.
They only come down when there's food, really.
Okay.
But, so I used to climb up. I found this vantage point, and then I always went down just before dark when Mum was there. And sometimes if the chimps slept near, I wanted to sleep up there, to be there when they woke in the morning, not have to get up really early and climb all the way up again. But I always used to run down to have supper with Mum. And then, I left her alone, and there was a leopard at that time. She was the brave one.
Wow.
Because I was living my dream.
Yes.
Anyway, so I would then go back up, and I was scared of leopards, and there were quite a few then.
Did you ever had an experience where you were threatened or afraid?
No, the reason I think I was a bit scared was because when I was back in Nairobi, a leopard had killed somebody's dog, and the remains of the dog was put into a trap, a cage, and the leopard went in after the dog the next day and was caught, and of course was terrified.
Yeah.
And so I went there. He was going to be relocated to somewhere wild, and the fierceness of the leaping at the cage, and it was very heavy, but anyway, so I think that gave me a sort of, but I only ever met one close up at Gombe, and he didn't do anything. So when I was climbing up at night, I had this ridiculous idea. I had my torch, and so I was walking in a little pool of light, and I was thinking, well, I'm perfectly safe in my pool of light. Well, of course, it was the opposite. That showed all the animals where I was. And I knew that, but still, that was my safe place.
Wow, I'm glad. They're afraid of fire. You got lucky because of that. So I know your mother was a very important person for you, but where do you get your inspiration? I know I read a little story and you told me sometime about a dog. Rusty maybe was his name? Rusty.
Rusty.
That it was like a big inspiration for you in having this sensibility for nature.
Well,
Tell us that story.
after I'd been at Gombe for 2 years, Leakey told me I had to get a degree. No time for an undergraduate degree. He got me a place to do a PhD in ethology, animal behavior. And I was nervous as anything. Cambridge, top university at that time. And when I got there, I was told I'd done everything wrong. No names for the chimps. You can't talk about personality, mind, or emotion. Those are unique to us. And you can't have empathy with your subject because to be a good scientist, you've got to be objective. And if you care about your subject, you can't be objective. Well, I knew from this wonderful teacher that this was absolutely, totally wrong, that the scientists were talking rubbish.
And you were a girl at the time. No many girls were like studying as scientists, right?
Well, no, but the point was that because of Rusty, you can't have a dog or a cat or a whatever. We are not the only beings with personalities, minds, and emotions. And so I just quietly went on talking about them the way they are. And then Hugo van Lawick was sent and his film started going around. And so science gradually had to accept that, we're not the super beings separated from all the other animals, but we're part of the amazing animal kingdom. So, I got my PhD and then I went back to Gombe.
And then you went to get your PhD after how many years of being at Gombe?
2.
Only 2 years. And I think there's still a lot of that in science today, of keeping that distance between the subjects of study and the scientists.
Unfortunately, that's true. On the other hand, now young people can study animal emotion. They can actually study animal intellect, which you couldn't then because it didn't exist. So there has been a big change. And it's getting harder and harder and harder for people to maintain that animals don't have emotions and that they can't have an intellect that can solve problems. In fact, I talk about it in every single lecture with examples.
I hope that changes fast, because I think the only way for us to make it as a species into the future is to understand that we're just part of nature.
We're part of nature.
We're just not superior to any other species. We're just.
I mean, just for an example, there's a famous pig known as Picasso. Not Picasso, Picasso. And her paintings are selling for up to $25,000.
Wow.
She loves to paint. She has the brush in her mouth, and she just does this joyously like this.
No way.
And she will even dip it in a new color herself.
God.
Yes. And then there are the giant forest rats in Tanzania and other parts of Africa too. And they can be taught to detect the smell of the explosive in a landmine that's buried deep under the ground after one of the long civil wars. They've helped clear up landmines from Mozambique. They're working in Angola and Cambodia and other countries. I've watched them being trained. And honestly, now they're learning how to detect illegally trafficked animals or parts of animals like pangolin scales, tusks, ivory, rhino horn, and watching them being trained. They're so intelligent.
I recently read this book, probably, and if you haven't read it, I really recommend it. It's from a guy named Ed Young, and it's called An Immense World. And it talks about how we humans judge intelligence based on our own view and our own intelligence, but that intelligence is out there in the world, and every single species has is brilliant in things that we cannot even comprehend, because we don't even have the senses to comprehend certain ways of living. I mean, elephants, the way they feel in their with their feet, and bats, the way they see the world through sonar, and so many examples that we are missing a lot.
Oh, we're missing masses. But I read stories about the San people in South Africa, We used to call them bushmen. And they also can feel with their feet. We have senses, but because of the way we live today, we don't use them anymore. So, we could develop some of those. But I mean, think of things like bees with their dance. I mean, we humans could never do anything like that. And they're now discovering that what used to be thought instinctive behavior, they've learned all this, but they're actually using a brain as well. Think of the octopus. You've seen my octopus teacher.
Of course.
I met Craig Foster and spent nearly a whole day with him.
Yeah.
It was magic.
It was what he did is incredible, and actually, which is it's funny to me to see it, but there's a lot of people that actually stop eating octopuses just because of that film.
Yes.
But the funny thing to me is that, okay, but why you stop only eating octopuses? That's just you focus on one animal, but that replicates all over the animal kingdom.
It's even worse if you think of the intensive animal farms, the way that I think if people saw how pigs who were as intelligent as dogs and cows, who are also much more intelligent than anybody thought, and they have these long-term bonds with their calves, if they're allowed to. And, people saw how they're treated. It's just awful. I couldn't possibly eat. And then the way dairy cows are treated in these intensive farms. It's completely horrible. But, that's why I work with young people, because, somebody the other day actually said, "You mean milk comes from inside a cow? That's disgusting. I'll never drink milk again." So, there's a lack of understanding out there, too.
They keep it so hidden from us, from people, because it's so crazy that there's this phrase by Paul McCartney that says if slaughterhouses had like glass, people will stop eating animals just because.
But they would have to.
It's a crime.
Because the first time I learned about this, because in England we didn't have those farms, I was reading Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation.
Yep.
And the next time I looked at meat on my plate, I think it was in an aeroplane, I thought, this symbolizes fear, pain, death. That's when I stopped eating meat.
And we treat them as commodities, not as sentient beings.
Exactly.
And I think nature will make us pay for that somehow. It's already doing so, but we don't understand it.
Definitely, because they've been given all these antibiotics, and we're, building up resistance, so the antibiotics don't work anymore for us in some diseases. More and more antibiotics are now useless. And the intensive agriculture with its pesticides and herbicides killing the soil, and making us sick.
And giving us cancers, because recently I read that, which is great news, they're putting processed meat in the same category as cigarettes.
Well, it's high time.
It's about
when
time.
Rachel Carson with Silent Spring, she predicted this in, I think it was 1960 or something like that.
Yeah. So what do you learn about humans while studying chimps?
Sorry, what?
What do you learn about humanity, while studying chimpanzees?
That we've been so ridiculously arrogant. I've learned how similar our behavior is. I mean, they kiss, embrace, hold hands, pat one another. Two males, the males are the dominant sex, and there's a lot of competition to get to the top of the hierarchy. And they'll stand upright and swagger from foot to foot, and sometimes shake their fist and face punched in a furious scowl. Doesn't that remind you of some human male politicians?
Yes, it does.
It does, doesn't it? And, the way the mothers and their young ones, good mothers and less good mothers, and all this variety and personality. And they sadly have a dark side, just like us. They can kill. They have a kind of warfare. But they also have love, compassion, and true altruism, just like us. And now we know that we share 98.7% of DNA with them. They're our closest relatives, along with a little bonobo.
They're very similar to us.
They're
Very similar to us.
Yep. And when it was sad, when I discovered, I thought they were like us, but nicer. And then when I discovered that they have this brutal side, I thought that makes them more like us than I thought.
A question about this from what we were speaking before is, because sometimes having conversations with people, they ask me this. We are a natural carnivores because our closest relatives, they eat a lot of meat. And I say, well, our closest relatives are chimpanzees. We share 98 point something percent of our DNA. How much do they actually eat in terms of animal protein? Chimpanzees?
About 2% per year.
2%?
That's all.
That's all.
Some eat much less. It's the hunting they enjoy.
Okay.
But it's, I would say, the biggest difference between them and us is this explosive development of our intellect. So yes, animals are way more intelligent, but when I talk about the difference, I say we're much more intellectual, not much more intelligent, because an intelligent species wouldn't be destroying its only home. And so it's kind of ridiculous that a creature that can send a rocket up to Mars with a little robot taking photographs, a creature that can invent the internet, and yet we're destroying our planet. And, it's our intellect that should, like chimps, we can love, we can be altruistic, we can also hate. And I truly think chimpanzees are capable of hating.
Of hating?
Yes, even hating. There are just a few stories that suggest, and other animals too, wild dogs, things that I've seen that suggest something that's very close to hate, just hating someone. But with our intelligence, we ought to be able to, with our brains rather, we ought to be able to, push ourselves to the bright side and lower the dark side. And some people do. There are people fighting for it all the time. I see our species right now, because we are going through dark times, aren't we? Politically, socially, certainly environmentally. And I see us at the mouth of a very long, very dark tunnel. And right at the end is a little star, and that's hope. But it's no good sitting at the mouth of the tunnel hoping the star will come. We have to roll up our sleeves, crawl under, climb over, work around all the obstacles, and they are, they're climate change, their loss of biodiversity. People don't often talk about the importance of alleviating poverty. But when you're really poor, you will destroy the environment to survive. Buy the cheapest rubbish, which is harming the environment because you can't afford anything else. And then, there's all the other things like the intensive farming and all the things that we've mentioned and all those that we haven't. Good news, there's a group of people or groups of people fighting every one of these things, even including corruption. Sadly, so often they work in their own little silo. And if you don't think holistically, you may actually solve your problem, but this might create another problem.
Yep.
So, for example, yes, we've closed down a coal mine. Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. All that CO2 is now no longer going into the environment. Yeah. But you haven't thought of the jobs that are being lost and the people who will then have no money and resort to goodness knows what. But there are groups of people, certainly in America, who train people whose industry is closing in a different job.
Yep.
So if you think holistically, you can do win-win-win.
I couldn't agree more. So you were very happy in Gombe studying chimpanzees, but of course you realized that the world was falling apart and that you needed to go out and share your knowledge and inspiring people to stop doing so. But if that wouldn't have been the case, would you have stayed in Gombe, like living the rest of your life there? If the world was in a
Oh,
in a good place?
yes, if I hadn't learned that forests were being destroyed and chimpanzee numbers were dropping and all the rest of it, I could have spent the rest of my life in Gombe. But in 1986, I learned about all these things, the cruelty and captivity as well, and I knew I had to try and do something. I didn't really know what to do, but I went around, there were by then 6 other chimp study sites, and learned a lot about the problems facing the chimps, but also about the problems facing the African people living in and around, their crippling poverty, lack of health, education, infertile soil from over-farming, penetrating into the wilderness to get more land, cutting down the trees to try and make more money from charcoal or timber. And that's when it hit me. If we don't help these people find ways of living without destroying the environment, we can't save chimps, forests, or anything else. And so that began our JGI, Jane Goodall Institute program, Take Care or Takari, which began in the 12 villages around Gombe, very holistic, including things like scholarships to give girls a chance of secondary education, increasing fertility of overused land without chemicals, microfinance, so that people can start their own small, environmentally sustainable businesses. And that's been so successful. It's now in 104 villages throughout Chimp Range in Tanzania. And it includes new technology like GIS, GPS, satellite imagery, camera traps, all that kind of stuff. And the people have understood that protecting the environment isn't just for wildlife. It's their own future that's at stake. And that's now in 6 other African countries. And it's ready to go anywhere now. We've just written a book on the method and how super successful it's been. And it's the first true community-led conservation program ever.
Well,
I mean, yes, the scientists used to throw out bits of meat and bits of money, but this was a group of local people going into the villages, sitting down, asking them what we could do, and starting like that till they trusted us.
so, I mean, as an environmentalist, I've been around, I've seen the human scar in the world. I've seen pollution of the oceans, of rivers, deforestation, mining, wildlife trafficking. We've lost, I think, 65% of wildlife in the last 50 years, which is my lifetime.
Yeah.
And in my lifetime, imagine in my lifetime thinking 65% of wildlife is being lost. I think the chimpanzees population in the 1900s was more than 1 million chimps, right? Today is less than 200,000, I think.
Maybe 300, but
Or maybe
it's
300.
going down.
And it's going down. So how do you, because that, and we're going to talk about hope immediately after this, but how do you see the state of the world right now? Because this is the way I see it, and I keep trying to keep my hopes up and working to do whatever I can. But how do you see the state of the world today, environmental-wise?
Well, it's grim. I think we've got a window of time to at least slow down climate change, loss of biodiversity, but it's closing. So the future depends on how we act now. And a lot of that, I'm spending more than 50% of my time and effort with young people, with our program that we call Roots and Shoots, which began with 12 high school students in Tanzania who were worried about poaching in the national park, street children with no homes, people throwing stones at stray dogs, all sorts of things. Yeah. And so the program, its main message, every individual, every one of us makes an impact of some sort every day. And unless we're really poor, we can choose what sort of impact we make. And that each group would choose 3 projects because everything's interrelated. 1 to help people, 1 to help animals, 1 to help the environment. And that's now in 70 countries.
Wow.
And it's got members from kindergarten through university, more and more adults taking part. And, so that's my main job, is going around. And the program is giving hope to young people. And you know, the suicide rate's been going up, and young people are losing hope. They were even losing hope in 1991 when I began the program.
Okay.
But it gives them hope, all of them. They say, you know, we're going to do our bit. And they're so enthusiastic and dedicated and determined that they will make a difference and that they will save the planet.
Well, we're going to make your program here in Colombia big for sure. Regarding young people, because I have a lot of faith and a lot of hope because of young people, because I see great things. But I also see all these, or I have a 6-year-old, Kai, that you've met recently. And I see how intuitively he wants to be in nature, and he loves animals, because we all love animals when we are growing up. But also there comes technology and the screens and the phones and the movies and the YouTubes and all of this technology that is kind of like very difficult to take him, like to keep him away from them. And that I think it's removing them in a way from nature, because you grew up in the dirt, bringing worms to under your pillow. I grew up getting my feet and my hands like dirty. But today that's harder because of the screens, because of technology, because of the entertainment that is going on. How do you see that problem?
Well, I see it as a huge, huge problem. It's one of the things we try and fight in Roots and Shoots. And, you know, then in the inner city, it's very hard anyway to get young people into nature. But on the other hand, if you do manage to get some young person from a very poor area in an inner city, I remember one, he was an 18-year-old black teenager in the Bronx. And we managed to get him out onto a riverbank where the Roots and Shoots group were. They had little nets, and they were seeing what was in there and looking at it and then putting it back. And there was a swan there, and he came not wanting to be there. By the end, his face changed, and he was alight with curiosity, and he was so excited, he asked me if I would go to the 6 schools he was involved with and talk to the children.
Okay, wow. Amazing.
We try very hard to get to the inner city.
Okay.
We try very hard to get children. We try and give them, you know, things that they have to go into nature to do. And of course, doing this community mapping, that takes them out. And then, you know, challenging them, getting groups to see who can be the first one to see a returning migrating swift, for example. Things like that.
One of the problems that I see is that people think that because they understand climate change or the problem, that's enough. And some people see this environmental degradation that is very far away from them. Okay, the Amazon is getting deforested, Indonesia, the oceans are getting polluted, but that's very far away. The glaciers are melting, but that's also very far away. And I don't see the connection between everyday life of people. Every time they make a purchase, every time they cut a tree to build a parking lot right next to their houses, that's part of the degradation of the environment. So how do you see the connection of people, of what can people do in their everyday lives to be part of the solution and to understand that that they are part of the problem if they don't change their own lives?
Yep, their own environmental footprint.
Exactly.
And a lot of people feel that just because they're an ordinary person, you know, they can't really do anything much. They can't change the world's problems. Nobody can. But so I say, no, don't. There's a saying, think globally, act locally. It's the wrong way around. Act locally. Find it. What do you care about? Maybe it's trash. Maybe it's a little piece of woodland that's going to be cut down to make yet another supermarket. Whatever it is, get people around you and see what you can do about it. Then you find you can do something. And then you want to do more. And then you realize around the world other people are all, you know, trying to do their little bit, which makes a huge difference. And that's why Roots and Shoots, we bring the young people probably when they're about 18. We bring them together as much as we can, usually virtually, and they get strength from each other. And they get, enthusiastic that, yes, we can get together. And then the other thing is the news is full of doom and gloom, and we need to know for sure. But there are so many incredible people doing amazing things, and that's not shared enough because people seem to think that only the bad news is newsworthy, but it's not true anymore. People are longing for good news. And so that's another of my missions, is to share all the good news stories. Problems of internet, AI, I can't deal with those, but I think each one of us has some particular way in which we can do our bit to make a difference. And if everybody does that, and I'll tell you one little story. I was talking to a whole group of CEOs. I do that quite a lot. And this man came up to me, has a big international corporation. He said, Jane, for 8 years, I've really, really been trying to get my company to be sustainable and ethical. And that's in the countries where we source our goods, in the supply chain as much as possible, in our offices around the world, and the way we treat our customers. For 3 reasons. 1, seeing the writing on the wall, we're using up natural resources too fast. We're having too heavy demands, our unsustainable lifestyles, all of that. Secondly, consumer pressure. People are beginning to ask for products that are made sustainably and ethically. And when people say to me, yes, I know, but it costs more. But if something costs a bit more, then you value it more and waste less. And waste is a huge problem. But he said the third reason, which really did it for me, was my little girl, aged 10. She came back from school one day and she said, Daddy, they tell me that what you're doing is hurting the planet. That's not true, is it, Daddy? Because it's my planet.
Wow.
That got to him.
Of course.
And I tell it to CEOs, it gets to them too. And this is what I want to say, that when you want to try and change the way somebody's thinking, it's no good arguing. It's no good pointing fingers. It's no good telling people that they're bad and they're wrong and they should do this and not that. You've got to reach the heart. And I think the best way is with a story.
Yes, I think actually that at the end, the environmental crisis, it's a spiritual crisis. It's a disconnection from our own nature. And of course that disconnects us from nature, which we are. So I think it's at the end of the spiritual crisis. And I was going to ask you, because you travel a lot, you talk to many leaders, not only business leaders, but also presidents, and I have this idea that money make people a little bit dumb. And I mean, they try to. I'm gonna explain myself a little bit, but instead of like helping this crisis of the environment that is going to affect us all, including them. Instead of that, there's you read the news and they're just building bunkers underground to be able to survive the apocalypses, and they're coming up with these ideas of like building a new planet on Mars, and this sort of like, I think it's
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk, exactly. Which and then I say. But then I wanted to ask you, when you talk to these leaders, and the little story that you just told me is part of the answer, but are you getting more answers like that from these leaders, or that's not the case?
I think very often it plants a seed in their minds. I think many of them would not want to admit that I'd managed to reach their heart, but that afterwards you would see some signs of change. I haven't measured it. I don't know. I don't know how to do that. But you started off by talking about money, and that is the real evil. Because, governments, in a democracy, you can elect the right kind of government leader. But And I've seen people go into government and they really care about the environment and they want to introduce all kinds of laws. But then, as I say, it makes product a little bit more costly. And so people turn their backs on them and they don't elect them anymore. And the big oil companies and other, mining companies and so on, they don't want to change. They don't want to believe in climate change. Or if they believe in it, they say it was nothing to do with us because they want to go on making money. And, there are companies that are changing, like the one I just mentioned. But few and far, there's more greenwashing than real change. And it's money. And alleviating poverty is one part of it. Reducing our unsustainable lifestyle is another. There's no single solution. I wish there was. But, that's why I'm fighting so hard, because our roots and shoots kids, when they grow up and they're already in decision-making positions, and they hang on to these values of compassion and understanding, respect.
I think hope relies on the youth and the young. I totally agree with that, because we need to build a different civilization in a way.
Yeah.
Because the one we built so far is just not sustainable.
Yes, it's
It cannot continue forever. We live in a planet with finite resources. It cannot continue forever consuming the way we're consuming. So we need to build a new world.
And it can only be done with the young people. Good news is young people change their parents, like the story I told you about the CEO, and that's happening all over, all the time. And, that's why I'm desperate to find ways of getting roots and shoots everywhere. And, it is growing much faster now.
Well,
people want hope.
People want hope.
Yeah.
So you are 90 now.
Yeah.
Do you have any plans to stop down, like to slow it down, or?
Well, my body may have plans that way. I just carry on as long as my poor old body will obey my wish.
Well, we hope to have you for a long, long time. Thank you for everything that you do. What's a message for hope that you want to end up this conversation with?
Well, I think the most important message, honestly, is for everybody to understand that they're here in this planet and that they have a role to play, even if they don't know what it is, and that every single one of us makes some impact every single day. And most of us can choose what sort of impact we make. What do I buy? Is it cheap because of unfair wages? Did it harm the environment when it was made? Was it cruel to animals? If we all start thinking like that, then we can create a better world.
Este episodio es una coproducción de Aja Podcasts, el equipo de la no ficción y de Nicolás Ibargüen. El guión fue escrito por Juan Camilo Hernández Meléndez. La ilustración de la portada es de Isabela Soto Vallejo. La mezcla y el diseño de sonido son de Valentina Fonseca. La canción de introducción y cierre es de Manuela Mejía y el handpan es interpretado por Felipe Ibargüen. Si tienen comentarios o sugerencias, escríbanos en nuestro Instagram, @podcastelemental. Y si les gusta este trabajo, ayúdenos a regar la voz. Recomiéndelo a amigos o familia a quienes les pueda servir o interesar. También no se olviden de darle clic al botón de seguir o follow y a la campanita dentro del show Elemental para no perderse ningún capítulo nuevo. Muchas gracias por escucharnos.